Every decision you made today felt right. Every conclusion you reached felt earned. Every belief you're currently holding feels like it came from somewhere honest, from careful thought, real experience, actual evidence. That feeling is so constant, so quietly present in the background of everything you think, that you've almost certainly never stopped to examine it. You simply believe what you believe. It feels true, and you move on. That's the problem. Not that you believe things, but that believing them feels exactly the same, whether they're true or not. There is no internal warning signal when your mind reaches a flawed conclusion. No shift in texture, no subtle discomfort, no flicker of uncertainty to alert you that what you're holding isn't accurate. The sensation of knowing something and the sensation of only believing you know it are physiologically identical. Your brain cannot tell the difference from the inside, and neither can you, unless you learn to look for the gap between those two things, which almost no one does, because the gap is invisible by design. Think about what that actually means. The instrument you use to check whether your thinking is sound is the same instrument that produced the thinking. The mind evaluating the mind. The judge ruling on their own case. And if the tool you use to detect errors is itself capable of generating them, quietly, convincingly, with complete confidence, then you have a problem that does not get solved by simply trying harder. You cannot weigh a broken scale on itself and find the flaw. The scale will always tell you it's working perfectly. This isn't a philosophical puzzle. It is something you can trace directly into the shape of your own life. The arguments you've had where you were certain and later discovered you were wrong. The decisions that felt obvious and then became confusing in hindsight. Most people walk away from those moments thinking they simply made a mistake. What they rarely consider is that the mistake wasn't just in the conclusion. It was in the way the mind was working, not what it produced, how it worked. And that's a completely different problem. That is where this begins. History is full of people who were wrong with perfect confidence. Physicians certain that hand-washing was unnecessary and who dismissed the colleague who proved otherwise. Scientists who rejected continental drift because the land looked fixed and the idea sounded absurd. Investors who saw no danger in the very markets that were days from collapse. These weren't careless people. Many were the most credentialed, the most experienced minds of their time. And that credentialed, experienced certainty was precisely what made them so difficult to correct. Being wrong doesn't feel like being wrong. It feels like being right. That's not a flaw in some people. That's how the brain works in all of us. You can see this in the smallest moments. They don't need to be historical. Think about the last time you were completely sure you left something somewhere and it wasn't there. Or the last time you remembered a conversation differently than the other person did, and you were both utterly certain of your own version. Or the last time you sent a message, reread it immediately, and saw something you were sure wasn't there when you wrote it. These are not random errors. They are windows into something structural about how memory and perception actually function. What these moments reveal is that your mind does not experience itself as a system that generates representations of the world. It experiences itself as the world. Whatever it produces feels like reality, not like a version of reality, filtered through your current emotional state, your past experiences, your existing assumptions. That filter is invisible. You cannot feel its edges. You cannot see around it. And the fact that it's invisible is not a coincidence. It is precisely what makes it effective and precisely what makes it dangerous. You are not seeing the world and then thinking about it. You are thinking and calling the result the world. And here is where it starts to matter practically. If your mind's output feels indistinguishable from reality, then every time you are wrong, it will feel exactly like being right. Not vaguely right, not tentatively right, completely right. With the same quiet, unquestioned certainty you feel right now, processing these ideas through a brain that is, even in this moment, filtering, selecting, and deciding what feels true and what doesn't. The question is not whether that filter exists. It does. The question is what you are willing to do with that knowledge. Here is something worth sitting with carefully. Your brain was not designed to find the truth. That sounds extreme, so say it slowly. Your brain is capable of extraordinary things. But its primary purpose, the function it was shaped by millions of years of evolution to perform, is not accuracy. It is survival. And survival does not require truth. It requires speed. It requires confidence. It requires being certain enough to act, even when the full picture is nowhere near complete. A brain that pauses to evaluate all available evidence before responding to a threat is a brain that doesn't survive the threat. So your brain evolved to cut corners, to rely on assumptions, templates, and patterns built from past experience, rather than careful analysis of the present moment. It makes fast, cheap decisions that are good enough most of the time and wrong in ways that are not always obvious. This is not a bug. This is the design. The biases that distort your thinking are not malfunctions. They are features that once, in a very different world, worked reliably well. The cost of that efficiency is a mind that arrives at conclusions with more confidence than the evidence warrants. Every single day, and the part that makes this hard, it doesn't feel like a shortcut. It feels like thinking clearly. That's why it keeps working. Think about the last time you formed a strong opinion about someone after a single conversation, or made a snap judgment about a situation that later turned out to be more complicated than it appeared. You weren't being reckless. You were being efficient. Your brain did what it was built to do. It found the fastest available interpretation and treated it as sufficient. The problem is that in the world you actually live in, the most costly errors are no longer about physical threats. They're about misread situations, misunderstood people, and decisions made on incomplete frames. And the machinery doesn't know the difference. It is still optimizing for speed. Understanding this changes something at the foundation. When you notice yourself jumping to a conclusion without examining it, or defending a belief without really being able to justify why you hold it, you are not witnessing a personal failure. You are watching ancient machinery execute the function it was designed for. The machinery isn't wrong for doing what it does, but you are now operating in a context that requires something the machinery was never built for: the ability to slow down, question what feels obvious, and remain open to being wrong about things that currently feel unquestionably right. Your brain is, above everything else, a pattern recognition engine. From the first moment of each morning, it is scanning, sorting, and compressing, taking the raw, unfiltered complexity of the world and reducing it to recognizable shapes. Familiar faces, expected sequences, predictable outcomes. This is how you can drive a familiar route while thinking about something completely unrelated. This is how you can read a sentence with words missing and still understand every word. The brain fills in what it expects, because expecting is faster than observing. This is a remarkable capability. Without it, every moment would be overwhelming, a flood of unprocessed information, with no structure, no meaning, no way forward. But the same mechanism that makes you fast also makes you predictable to yourself. Once a pattern is established, your brain applies it. And patterns, by their nature, are generalizations. They describe what is usually true, not what is always true. When the pattern fires and the situation doesn't fit, your brain often doesn't catch it. It has already moved on, already confident. It recognizes this from before. That's not careful observation. That's a template running on autopilot. The pattern fires. The conclusion arrives. And the question, is this actually what's happening here? Doesn't get asked, because the brain already feels like it knows. You see this in how you interpret tone in a text message, reading something cold when it may have been neutral, in how you categorize someone's behavior based on the first impression you formed of them months ago, in how you predict what someone is about to say before they finish, because someone like them always says this. Sometimes those patterns are accurate. More often, they are approximations. And the cost of approximation is that the actual person in front of you, the actual situation, the actual message, gets replaced by the version your brain already decided it would be. Reality gets overwritten by expectation. You stop seeing what's there. You see what you prepared for. The patterns you carry about yourself are the most consequential of all and the most resistant to examination. The story of what you're capable of, what you deserve, how people tend to respond to you, What kinds of things always go wrong? These are patterns too. But because they feel like self-knowledge, rather than assumption, they rarely get questioned. They feel like facts you simply know, rather than conclusions you reached on incomplete evidence years ago from inside a perspective that may have changed substantially since. Your mind isn't just running on patterns. In a very real sense, it is the patterns it has built. And patterns are not facts. They are guesses that got comfortable. There is a force operating in your mind, right now, that you almost certainly cannot feel. It is not occasional or situational. It is constant, directional, and invisible in its operation. It is pushing you, gently, persistently, toward information that agrees with what you already believe. And it is steering you away, with equal consistency, from information that doesn't. Psychologists call this confirmation bias. It is one of the most thoroughly documented tendencies in all of human cognition. And here is the part that matters. Knowing about it does not make you immune. Not even slightly. When you encounter information that confirms what you already think, your mind receives it easily. It feels self-evident. It slots in, without friction. No scrutiny required. But when you encounter information that contradicts your belief, something different happens. Your mind goes to work. It looks for weaknesses in the source. It finds technical objections. It imagines alternative explanations. It applies a level of rigor to the challenging information that it never once applied to the confirming information. And because this process feels like careful, critical thinking, it almost never gets caught. You don't search for truth. You search for confirmation. And your brain calls it reasoning. That's why two people can watch the same video and walk away more convinced than ever of opposite things. The loop this creates is self-sealing. The belief shapes what you look for. What you find reinforces the belief. The reinforced belief narrows what you're willing to look for next. Over time, the belief stops feeling like a position you arrived at and starts feeling like a simple, obvious fact. The kind of thing only an unreasonable person would challenge. And by that point, the confirmation bias isn't just influencing your thinking. It has become your thinking. The filter has become the lens through which everything is seen, and the lens itself has become invisible. This is where it becomes a problem you genuinely can't ignore. Because here is what confirmation bias actually costs you. Not just individual wrong beliefs, but the capacity to update. A mind running on confirmation doesn't just hold false beliefs, it actively resists the information that would correct them. It is structurally closed to revision. And in a world that is genuinely complex, genuinely changing, full of people and situations that don't fit the templates your brain built years ago, a mind that cannot update is a mind that keeps colliding with reality and keeps blaming reality for not cooperating. The trap has no visible walls. That's what makes it a trap. And that's what makes it so hard to escape without first understanding, in precise detail, exactly how it works. At some point, most people discover that thinking more doesn't lead to clarity. It leads somewhere else, somewhere circular, exhausting, and oddly hard to leave. You think through a problem, then think through it again, then wonder whether you thought about it correctly the first time. You examine every angle until there are no new angles left, and then you go back to the ones you've already covered, hoping they'll look different now. They don't. The mind spins, and what feels like productive effort is actually the same loop of ground, traveled over and over, worn deeper each time, into a groove that gets harder to exit. You might be thinking right now, okay, but I'm aware of these patterns. Doesn't that help? That's the exact moment. This gets harder than it sounds. Awareness, without the right relationship to it, tends to become another layer of the loop. You become aware that you're overthinking. Then you think about the fact that you're overthinking. Then you wonder if thinking about overthinking is itself a form of overthinking. The machinery folds back on itself, and the loop expands to include the meta level, a larger loop containing all the smaller ones. More analysis applied to the same question in the same frame, with the same underlying assumptions, produces the same narrow range of answers, just louder, and with considerably more exhaustion attached. What overthinking actually reveals is a specific intolerance of uncertainty. When something is unresolved, your brain registers it as an open thread, a loose end that needs tying before you can rest. So it keeps returning to the problem. But the goal of all that returning is not really to solve anything. The goal is to eliminate the discomfort of not knowing. And those are completely different objectives. One requires new information or a new frame. The other just requires running the same process, faster, harder, more exhaustively, until the anxiety is worn down enough to feel like resolution. It isn't resolution. It's fatigue disguised as an answer. The loop doesn't break because you thought harder. It breaks when you stop treating uncertainty as a threat that must be eliminated. That is a different relationship with not knowing altogether. Not the resolution of uncertainty, but the tolerance of it, the willingness to act or rest or simply exist in a state where some things remain unresolved. This is harder than it sounds, because the brain experiences unresolved questions as genuinely aversive. But the capacity to sit with open questions without compulsively reaching for closure is one of the clearest markers of a mind that has developed real psychological flexibility. Not a mind that never doubts. A mind that can carry doubt without being consumed by it. You experience yourself as someone who makes choices. You deliberate, you weigh, you consider, and then you decide. The felt sense of agency, of being the author of your own actions, is so persistent and so convincing that most people never seriously question it. Of course you're choosing. Of course you're in control. Who else would be? But the science of decision-making has quietly accumulated a body of evidence, suggesting that what you experience as a deliberate choice is often the final step in a process that was largely complete before you were aware of it. Your brain makes enormous decisions below the threshold of consciousness. It evaluates options, assigns emotional weights, narrows the field, and then presents you with the experience of choosing, as if you were present for the entire deliberation. But you weren't. By the time you feel like you're deciding, the groundwork has already been laid. By your mood that morning, by your blood sugar, by the last conversation you had, by which article you read first. These factors shape outcomes in ways that are real, measurable, and almost entirely invisible to the person being shaped by them. Studies found judges give harsher sentences before lunch, not because they're cruel, because they're human, because the brain that feels most rational is still running on biology. This is where most people want to object. Yes, but I am careful. I think things through. My important decisions are made deliberately. And that is true, and it misses the point. The careful deliberation is real. The reflection is real. But it is all occurring inside a brain that is already primed, already framed, already pointing in a direction before the deliberation begins. The deliberation doesn't happen in a neutral space. It happens inside a context that was shaped by 100 things that had nothing to do with the decision at hand, and that you were never consciously aware of. You weren't thinking freely. You were thinking from inside a frame you didn't choose and didn't notice. Understanding this doesn't mean you stop making decisions or trusting your judgment. It means you hold your judgments a little more loosely. It means you stay genuinely curious about why a particular conclusion felt so obvious, because obvious is not neutral. Obvious is what the system was already pointing at before you started thinking. And a mind that can ask, even occasionally, why does this feel inevitable to me? That mind has already created something important. A small but real gap between the conclusion and the complete, unquestioned acceptance of it. And in that gap, something other than the automatic becomes possible. There is a version of yourself you probably believe in, a rational version. The one that looks at evidence, draws fair conclusions, and makes decisions based on what the facts actually support. And that version is real. You are capable of genuine reasoning. But your reasoning does not happen in a vacuum. It happens inside a body that is always feeling something. And feelings, your specific feelings, in this specific moment, have a way of shaping your logic so quietly, so completely, that the logic itself never notices it happened. It just arrives, fully formed, feeling justified. Emotions influence what information gets your attention, how that information gets interpreted, and which conclusions feel satisfying, once they land. A person who is afraid finds threats more easily, not because they're inventing them, but because fear literally narrows attention toward potential danger, and attention determines what feels real. A person who is angry finds evidence of injustice without searching for it. A person in love notices qualities in someone that a genuinely neutral observer would likely miss. The emotional state doesn't override the reasoning. It sets the direction of the reasoning before it begins. From upstream, before you're even aware, a conclusion is forming. It never feels like emotion. It feels like clarity. That's the mechanism. That's how it stays hidden. The particular sophistication of this process is how seamlessly it conceals itself. When emotion shapes a conclusion, it doesn't announce its presence. The conclusion arrives, wrapped in logic, complete with reasons, evidence, and the feeling of having thought it through responsibly. Fear doesn't say, "I am afraid, so I'm finding threats." It just highlights the threatening interpretation and lets your mind believe it arrived there through careful observation. Anger doesn't say, "I need this person to be wrong." It just makes the case against them feel airtight, unassailable, so obviously correct that challenging it feels almost unreasonable. And this is where it becomes genuinely uncomfortable. The emotions that are shaping you most are not the loud ones. They are the ones, so constant, you've stopped calling them emotions at all. You call them how things are. The low-grade anxiety that colors how you interpret ambiguous situations. The background sense of inadequacy that shapes what risks feel acceptable. The quiet, chronic fear of looking foolish that determines which ideas you voice and which you keep to yourself. These are not dramatic emotional events. They are the emotional weather you live inside, so consistent, so present, that they have long since stopped feeling like states and started feeling like facts. The world looks the way it looks, partly because of who you are, and mostly because of what you are feeling while you look at it. If you pay close enough attention, over time, you begin to notice that certain patterns repeat. The same kind of relationship playing out again with a different face. The same hesitation at the same kind of opportunity. The same argument surfacing across different contexts with different people, somehow always following the same arc and landing in the same place. Most people notice these patterns eventually. They recognize them with a combination of frustration and resignation. And what is genuinely strange is that recognizing them clearly, consciously, repeatedly, rarely seems to be enough to stop them from returning. The reason is not weak character. It is something more fundamental. Your brain doesn't only seek pleasure and avoid pain. It seeks, with equal power, what is familiar. Familiarity feels safe. Even when the familiar thing is painful, even when you know exactly where it leads, it carries the weight of the known. And the known is something your brain has already developed, a strategy to survive. The unfamiliar, even when it is objectively better, is uncertain. And uncertainty, to a brain wired for threat detection, registers as potential danger. So the familiar mistake feels less threatening than the unknown good. Not because this is why people return to relationships they know are damaging, why they repeat professional decisions they've already watched fail, why the path that led somewhere painful still feels more navigable than a path they've never taken. The brain is not choosing suffering because it wants suffering. It is choosing the familiar version of suffering because that version has already been survived. And the brain's deepest priority is not happiness, not growth, not self-improvement. It is the prevention of unknown threats for which it has no template. Familiar pain is manageable. Unknown possibility is a different category of risk entirely. Change isn't an intellectual problem. Knowing what to do differently is almost never the obstacle. The real obstacle is the specific discomfort of the unfamiliar, the physical, genuine, unmistakable feeling of walking a path the brain has not yet classified as survivable. That discomfort will not be argued away with logic. You can understand it completely and still feel it fully, but there is something useful that understanding does. It changes the story you tell yourself about what the discomfort means. When you can see that the pull you feel toward the familiar is pattern, not wisdom. When you can name it, as the brain protecting its templates rather than protecting your actual well-being. You have created the first real opening. Not freedom from the pattern, but a new relationship to it. And that is where things begin to shift. Beneath the patterns, beneath the shortcuts, beneath the emotional logic and the endless loops, there is something simpler and far older. Your brain, in its most fundamental operation, is a threat detection system. Everything else it does, the creativity, the analysis, the language, the love, is built on top of that original function. And while we have constructed philosophy and science and art over it, while we have layered extraordinary complexity onto that ancient base, the base has not changed. It is still running, still asking its original question, continuously, beneath everything else. Is this safe? Fear shapes perception more profoundly than almost any other force. When your brain is in a threat state, triggered not only by physical danger, but by social rejection, uncertainty, loss of control, or even an uncomfortable conversation, it changes how information is processed at a fundamental level. Attention narrows. Negative signals become more vivid and more memorable. Ambiguous situations are interpreted as threatening by default. The world, experienced through the filter of fear, looks genuinely different. Not just feels different, looks different. Because perception itself has been adjusted to serve the threat response. The part no one tells you. Most of what you experience as just how I think is at least partly fear running quietly in the background. Not dramatic fear. Constant, low-level, entirely normalized fear. Fear of being wrong. Fear of looking foolish. Fear of losing something. Fear of not being enough. These are not occasional emotional events. They are, for most people, the permanent background frequency of conscious life. So consistent, so present, that they long since stopped feeling like fear and started feeling like the normal texture of thinking. But they are shaping every evaluation you make, quietly steering your mind toward whatever interpretation feels safest, whatever conclusion carries the least threat, whatever path requires the least exposure to the unknown. And calling the result clear thinking. The mind doesn't just fear the world. Often, it fears itself, fears what it might find if it looked too closely at what it actually believes and why. The deepest version of this is the fear of uncertainty itself. Your brain doesn't merely dislike not knowing. It finds genuine uncertainty, genuinely aversive, in ways that have measurable neurological correlates. Research has found that a known bad outcome can feel less threatening than an unknown one with better odds. The brain would rather know it's going to lose than face the possibility that it might win in a way it can't predict. This preference disguises itself perfectly as intuition, as the quiet, authoritative sense that this is simply the right choice, the realistic choice, the grounded choice. It never announces that it is afraid. It never needs to. It has learned to speak in the language of reason. You might expect, at this point in the conversation, that awareness is the answer. That now you understand these mechanisms, you can simply watch for them, correct for them, think your way around them. That would be a satisfying conclusion. It would also be another version of the same problem, the mind deciding it now understands enough to trust itself again, just at a higher level. Awareness is not the solution, but it is the beginning of a different relationship with the problem, and that distinction matters more than it might initially seem. When you notice a thought, really notice it as a product of your mind, rather than as a direct transmission from reality. Something shifts. The thought doesn't disappear, but it changes in character. It moves from being what is true to being what I am currently thinking. And that is not a small difference. What is true feels external, solid, beyond question. What I am currently thinking is something produced by a particular mind, in a particular moment, shaped by a particular history and a particular emotional state. It might be accurate, but now it can be examined. And the moment it can be examined, the relationship to it has already changed. A thought you can see is no longer running you entirely. Visibility is not freedom from the pattern, but it is the end of the pattern's invisibility. And that changes everything about how much power it has. This is not a mystical process. It is something closer to the familiar experience of catching yourself doing something automatic, reaching for your phone without deciding to, or snapping at someone without meaning to. And in the catching, there is a pause. That pause doesn't require you to be a better person already. It doesn't require superior willpower or a fundamentally different personality. The pause is the change. Something has shifted simply in the act of being seen. The automatic process has been interrupted, not by force, but by noticing. And noticing, practiced consistently, becomes its own kind of skill. The biases don't vanish when observed. The patterns don't dissolve overnight, but their grip changes in a specific and important way. They lose the particular power that depended on invisibility. A pattern you can name is a pattern you are no longer fully inside. You are in a new relationship with it, one where you can sometimes choose a response rather than simply executing the automatic one. Not always, not immediately, but sometimes and increasingly. And a mind that can do that, even imperfectly, is already operating differently than a mind that cannot. Not because it is smarter, because it has created something real, a small space between stimulus and response. And in that space, something other than the automatic becomes genuinely possible. There is a quiet revolution available in the space between having a thought and believing it. For most people, these two events are fused. The thought arrives and is immediately accepted as an accurate report on what is real. But they are not the same event. Having a thought is something that happens to you. Believing it is something you do. A choice that usually moves too fast to feel like a choice, but a choice nonetheless. And the practice of slowing that moment down, even occasionally, even imperfectly, is one of the most practically significant things a mind can develop. Questioning your thoughts is not the same as distrusting everything or committing to permanent uncertainty. It is not a path toward paralysis or endless philosophical recursion. It is something more practical and more honest, the habit of asking, with genuine curiosity, where is this thought coming from? Not abstractly. Specifically, is this responding to what is actually in front of me, or to something older? A past experience that looked similar? A fear that's been activated without announcing itself? A familiar pattern wearing new clothing? Is this thought helping me see more clearly? Or is it protecting something I've already decided to believe? The question is not, am I right? That one's too easy to answer yes. The real question is, how would I know if I were wrong? If you can't answer that, something else is happening. These questions don't always produce dramatic answers. Often they produce something quieter and more useful, a slight loosening of certainty. A recognition that the conclusion you reached might be one of several possible interpretations, rather than the only reasonable one. That loosening feels uncomfortable at first, because certainty is restful and openness is effortful. But certainty held too tightly, in a world that is genuinely complex and genuinely surprising, becomes brittle. It breaks in ways that are difficult to recover from, not because being wrong is catastrophic, but because a mind that was never open to being wrong has no prepared way to respond when it is. The goal isn't a mind that trusts nothing. It's a mind that holds what it knows firmly enough to act and loosely enough to learn when the evidence changes. That balance, firm enough to act, loose enough to update, is what it looks like when thinking is actually working. The mind that can say, I believe this. I might be wrong. I am paying attention for evidence that I am. And I will not punish myself for changing course when I find it. That is not a mind without conviction. That is a mind whose conviction is placed in something more durable than certainty, in the process of genuine inquiry itself. And it begins simply with the practice of noticing what you think, and then asking, just occasionally, with real openness, is this actually true? There is one final thing worth sitting with slowly. It may be the most important thing in everything that's been explored here. The greatest risk, the one that carries the most capacity for real and lasting damage in your decisions, your relationships, the cumulative shape of your life, is not being wrong. Being wrong is ordinary. It is recoverable. It is how any honest mind eventually learns. The greatest risk is being wrong while feeling completely right. Because the feeling of rightness creates a closed system. It removes the internal pressure to keep looking. It silences questions before they can form. It is the mind at its most confident and its most blind, and those two things are not in tension. They are the same thing. Think about the moments in history and in ordinary private lives when the most harm was done. Almost always, they share a feature. The people involved were not operating from a conscious desire to cause damage. They were operating from a sense of complete rightness, from a conviction that what they were doing was justified, necessary, and obviously correct. The feeling of being right has been behind some of the most consequential individual decisions and collective failures in human history. Not doubt, not confusion, certainty, unexamined, unquestioned, thoroughly felt certainty. The kind that forecloses the questioning that might have changed everything. And now, you might expect a reassuring close, a list of techniques, a sense of resolution, a feeling that the problem has been addressed. But that would be its own kind of trap, because what has been described here is not a problem with a clean solution. It is a feature of being a mind. The biases, the patterns, the emotional logic, the fear running beneath everything. These are not obstacles between you and correct thinking. They are thinking as it actually functions. The goal is not to eliminate them. The goal is to hold them with enough awareness that they no longer hold you entirely, to think, while also being willing to question the thinking, to believe, while remaining genuinely open to being wrong. The most dangerous thoughts are not the ones that are wrong. They are the ones that feel so right, you never think to question them. So carry this forward as a question, not a conclusion. Not am I right? That question has never needed help getting answered. The question worth practicing is, how would I know if I weren't? What would it look like? What evidence would actually move me? If you can answer that, honestly and specifically, your beliefs are being held well. If no answer comes, if you find yourself reaching for reasons why any counter-evidence would itself be wrong, then your mind is protecting something it has already decided to believe. And whatever the mind protects, with that kind of automatic certainty, is always, always worth examining carefully. Not because it's necessarily wrong, but because the thoughts we never question don't just shape what we believe. They shape what we become, quietly, persistently, completely beneath awareness. Until, if we're paying close enough attention, they're not.